G'day everyone, Count Lurchlot here and welcome back to Lukewarm Opinions. Today I'm going to be covering the movie simply titled Spider-Man. Released in 2002 and directed by Sam Raimi, this was one of the first big Marvel superhero movies ever, and it's one of my personal favorites. Let's cover the plot, I'll talk about what I liked and didn't like about it, and give you my lukewarm opinion. The movie begins with narration by our main character Peter Parker, who tells about how his story isn't for the faint of heart. He also introduces us to the girl of his dreams, Mary Jane, who he wishes he was sitting next to. Sadly, he isn't. He officially gets introduced outside the school bus, begging them to stop because he's chasing after them. Unfortunately, Peter is one of those really nerdy characters who gets bullied a lot, and it's not just the students that are mean to him, also the bus driver who just keeps ignoring him. One thing that's regularly criticised about this movie is that a lot of people feel that Tobey Maguire at 26 years old was too old to play a teenager, but I've always been okay with it because I stopped being able to pass for a teenager when I was about 15 years old. So yeah, seeing a mid-20s man playing a 17-year-old doesn't bother me because that's what people thought I was a lot growing up. Mary Jane is actually the person who tells the bus driver to stop, finally letting Peter on. And this is really a credit to her because she gets a lot of criticism throughout these movies for how she's portrayed, but I'll get to that later. Peter does manage to get on the bus, but sadly it's followed by further bullying. We're then shown that these students are on a field trip to a laboratory that will change Peter's life forever. It is during this time that we are also introduced to Peter's best friend Harry Osborn, played by James Franco, and his father Norman Osborn, played by Willem Dafoe. Fun fact, James Franco actually auditioned to play Peter in this movie. He obviously didn't get it, and he had to dye his hair brown to match Willem Dafoe's so the two would look more like father and son, and I gotta say, it really works, because I honestly would believe these two are father and son, and I actually got them confused when I was little. Rewatching this movie after a long time, I also realised that Peter and Harry are kind of like opposites because Peter, while not raised by one of his parents, is raised by both his aunt and uncle, who are very loving, support him through everything, and are middle class, they're not very well off. Harry, on the other hand, is raised by his father, but his father isn't a very loving and encouraging person, and they're very rich. So yeah, if you really think about it, they're very opposite, these two. Before they enter the laboratory, Peter gets to meet Norman for the first time, which does feel kind of odd to me because you would think you would meet your best friend's father before you're about 18 years old, but I digress. Norman takes an immediate liking to Peter because Peter is essentially everything Norman wished Harry would be, which is pretty cruel and shows that he's been a pretty neglectful and honestly horrible father, but anyway, that'll come into play later. They enter the laboratory where Peter gets to show off his nerdy side while telling Harry about the various factors of the laboratory. The tour guide in this laboratory then starts explaining these three different types of spider abilities who all have these three very unique abilities, and these are all abilities that Spider-Man will eventually have himself. They even mention the well-known spider sense that we've seen in comics, cartoons, movies, you name it. This scene also reveals that Harry also has a crush on MJ and uses the knowledge Peter has told him to flirt with her, much to Peter's annoyance. The tour guide then mentions that they've merged the abilities of 3 spiders into 15 genetically altered super spiders. However, Mary Jane notices that one is missing. Briefly having a moment alone with MJ, Peter asks if he can take photos of her for the school paper, at which point the missing spider descends from a web onto Peter's hand. The spider bites Peter, leaving him with a nasty sore. The scene then changes to Norman Osborn's company Oscorp, which shows off a variety of different high-tech weapons, which will later be used by the villain, the Green Goblin. They are showing these weapons to the army, who are not impressed. They are only interested in something known as the human performance enhancers. One of the scientists reveals that during the animal testing, something went horribly wrong as one of the rodents became very violent and aggressive, which makes them want to take it back to formula, but this does not impress the military, who say they will pull their funding if they don't have a successful human test in only 2 weeks. The scene then changes to Peter's home where we meet his loving aunt and uncle. Their ages are also criticised because they're quite elderly and don't look like they would be the aunt and uncle of a teenage boy. Personally, I think it's fine because some people have kids very late in life and they could have a brother who's like a decade older than them, so I honestly think it's fine and people are just too nitpicky when it comes to this. In fact, here's a real fun fact. Cliff Robertson was 75 years old when he did this movie, his character was 68, and yet he still had to wear old man makeup, so I don't know why, I just think that's hilarious. Peter returns home and immediately goes to bed because he's not feeling well due to the spider bite. He crashes and he starts undergoing the genetic mutation that will turn him into Spider-Man. The creation of the villain happens simultaneously, with Norman testing the performance enhancers on himself with horrific results. At first he appears to have died, but after being revived he comes back with great strength and appears to have gone completely mad and evil. Peter wakes up the next day to discover he has undergone some odd physical changes. For one, he no longer needs glasses and has seemed to have gotten a lot buffer. Peter leaves his home to go to school and he discovers that Mary Jane seems to have a pretty abusive home life. While working up the courage to talk to her, Peter misses the bus again and he tries to catch up, and we get a repeat of the stop the bus scene, but this time Peter notices that he's got some particularly sticky fingers. We cut back to the school where during lunch, MJ trips on some OJ. Peter manages to catch her tray and all the food. Fun fact, this was a practical take that took 156 tries to do, which is just awesome to think about. During this time, Peter also discovers web coming out of his wrist, which he uses to accidentally being the key word, to hit the school bully with another lunch tray. While fleeing, he has his first Spidey sense moment and he's able to dodge a punch from the school bully, who we all know is called Flash Thompson. A fight ensues and Flash isn't able to land a single punch, even when it's 2 against 1, and Peter starts to fight back, realizes he has great strength and manages to beat Flash with a single punch. The students, however, are still calling him a freak, except for Harry, who think that's incredible. Because of this, he runs from school, and upon discovering that his hands are like spider feet now, he figures out he can climb walls and that he also has incredible jumping abilities. It's at this point that he tries testing out his web. Unlike most adaptations which have him with web shooters, the Peter in this adaptation uses organic web, and Sam Raimi had a real reason for why he did this. He just felt that he needed to ground this movie in reality a bit more, which I think is a key factor about that movie. It's more grounded in reality than the other Spider-Man movies. That being said, he felt it would be unrealistic for a teenager to make this chemically artificial web in their home. So, even though Peter's a genius, he just felt it was too unrealistic, so he had Peter use organic webs here. And I feel they kind of revisit this in Spider-Man Homecoming, because Tom Holland is never seen making webs at home, only at his school, because it has all the chemicals he needs to make his web. He then tries swinging, but he fails miserably. Peter heads home, where he finds Mary Jane leaving her house upset. During this time, they start discussing their futures, and Peter encourages her to pursue her dream of acting. However, then she goes off with Flash Thompson, who has just gotten a new car, and Peter thinks that maybe he can impress Mary Jane if he gets a car of his own. So he looks in a paper, finds something cheap for only $3,000, and he also sees an ad for amateur wrestling that'll earn him $3,000 if he can just last in the ring with someone for 3 minutes. So, of course, he thinks, yeah, I could do that. This is followed by a montage of him designing what would eventually become his iconic spider suit, and he leaves for wrestling under the guise that he's going to the library to study. His Uncle Ben drives him to the library and tries to give him some advice, including the iconic line, "With great power comes great responsibility." Unfortunately, Peter rejects his advice and tells him to stop pretending to be his dad, which really upsets Ben, and you can really see it by the look on his face. This is probably the most important part of the movie, and I'll explain why later. Peter ends up in the wrestling ring with a man named Bonesaw, played by actual pro wrestler Randy Savage. Peter is given the ring name Spider-Man by the announcer Bruce Campbell, who, fun fact, is a longtime collaborator with Sam Raimi and was in every Spider-Man movie but playing a different character in each. Everyone there thinks Peter will be an easy victory because of his small size, and to his surprise he ends up in a cage match. At first, Peter appears to be struggling in the match, but then when he starts taking the fight seriously, it leads to an easy victory. Unfortunately, Peter's cheated out of the full payment because he defeated his opponent in 2 minutes as opposed to 3, so they only give him $100 as opposed to the $3,000. Understandably, Peter's upset about this, but the guy's just like, "Oh, I missed the part where that's my problem." So Peter leaves very angry, and a robber comes in to rob this guy at gunpoint, and then when Peter sees the robber escaping, he just lets him through because, well, he's angry, he got cheated, why is he going to help this guy? And the guy even says, now he's going to get away with my money, but Peter again just says, "I missed the part where that's my problem." And yeah, Peter seems happy in this moment because he appears to just have gotten back at the guy who ripped him off, but this will become a very horrible mistake on Peter's part. Peter returns to the library to see a crowd of people surrounding someone. Peter pushes through the crowd and discovers that his uncle is the person of interest. Peter starts to talk to and tries to comfort his dying uncle, but unfortunately, Ben dies due to his injuries, and Peter is understandably upset by all this. This is why I felt their last conversation was important, because I've always held the belief, never have your last conversation with a loved one be a bad one, because you never, ever know what might happen, and this is a prime example of that. People also criticize Toby for crying too much, but I think it's deserved here because he is watching and holding the hand of the only father figure he's ever had, and he dies right in front of him. I think that earns a few tears. It definitely earned a few tears from me upon rewatching this. When he hears news about the robber, Peter goes from sad to enraged and goes off seeking revenge. He climbs the walls, jumps across a few buildings, and spots his uncle's car. It's at this point he figures out how to use his web for swinging, as it's the best way to catch up to the car. Peter jumps on the car and causes the robber to crash into a building where the chase continues. Peter corners the robber and roughs him up until the robber is literally begging for mercy, saying, "Give me the chance." But Peter just responds with, "What about my uncle? Did you give him a chance? Did you answer me?" And he pushes the robber into the moonlight, where Peter actually sees his face for the first time and realizes it was the robber he let go. So in that moment he realized he is basically responsible for his uncle's death, because if he hadn't let that guy through, his uncle might still be alive. This was kind of retconned in the third movie, but we'll get to that. Peter breaks the arm of the robber, who then falls out a window and dies. Peter then leaves to contemplate everything that he's done, because even though he caught up to the robber, he got his revenge, it didn't make him feel better. So he goes home and comforts his heartbroken aunt. We then cut to a scene that shows the army people who were at Oscorp before, who are witnessing a weapons test by an Oscorp competitor, but they are all killed by an unknown assailant. The scene then switches to Peter's high school graduation, where jealousy ensues as Norman spends most of his time comforting and giving attention to Peter and just flat out ignoring Harry. Harry, however, gets a one-up on Peter because he sees MJ break up with Flash and he becomes MJ's new boyfriend. Peter goes home and then laments on how much he misses his uncle, but then he really starts to think about his uncle's advice, takes it to heart, which begins the birth of Spider-Man. And that's something I think a lot of people forget. It wasn't the spider that turned him into Spider-Man, it was letting his uncle bend down and the words of advice he gave him. That is what turned him into Spider-Man. Following this, we get a montage of Peter performing heroic acts around the city, at which point we are then introduced to who is possibly the best casted comic book character in history, J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. Honestly, he embodied his character better than any other comic book character that came before or after, but that's just my opinion. And he realizes he can make a lot of money off having Spider-Man photos in his paper, even though he clearly sees Spider-Man as a menace to society. But regardless, thinking only about money, he decides to put an ad out in the paper advertising cash for photos of Spider-Man. Peter runs into MJ, who is working as a waitress while struggling to find work as an actress. It is during this time that Peter discovers she's dating Harry. Peter is now living in an apartment, which I can only assume is being paid for by Norman, because there is no way this place could be afforded by two college kids in New York, I'm just saying. It's at this point we see Peter's real struggle of trying to live two lives, because he's just lost his job from being late, because he's having trouble balancing both lives. And Harry points out, "Oh, Dad, you could help Peter find a job, right?" Peter declines, though, wanting to find his own way, which creates even more respect from Norman and more jealousy from Harry. Peter then sees the ad in the paper, realizing he can make cash from taking photos of himself. He literally does that. He takes photos of himself doing heroic acts and gives them to the Bugle. Sadly, he isn't being paid much and he can only get work as a freelance photographer. It's also in scenes like this that we get introduced to other recurring members of the Daily Bugle. Robbie Robinson, who does nothing but defend Spider-Man against Jonah, a real suck-up by the name of Hoffman, who is played by Ted Raimi, the director's brother, and Betty Brant, played by Elizabeth Banks. We then cut to a scene with the board of Oscorp firing Norman, and he's understandably angered by this because he's the one who started the company. This leads to what would eventually be the first real action scene of this movie. I feel it's important to mention that this movie doesn't have as many action scenes as many superhero movies does today, but I feel that was true of a lot of superhero movies in the early 2000s. This and the original X-Men movies really had a focus on telling the character's story and building up the characters, that action was really a secondary to this movie. I'm not bothered by this because, if anything, it gave us a lot of time with the characters, and it honestly makes this movie feel more unique to many of the other superhero movies we've gotten today. The action begins when a horrifying figure attacks during Oscorp Unity Day. Using destructive equipment stolen from Oscorp, panic ensues and Peter is forced to jump into action. I feel I should also quickly mention that this is the scene that includes the quick cameo from Stan Lee, which was common in a lot of Marvel movies until his death. The assailant quickly kills the board of directors while uttering a line that makes it very obvious that he is in fact Norman Osborn, because he reuses the line, "Out, am I?" Peter arrives dressed as Spider-Man and a fight ensues between the two. Peter struggles in this fight because it's the first time he's fighting someone with strength comparable to his own. I also think the action and effects in this movie still hold up despite it being 20 years old. The action ends with Peter sabotaging the Goblin's glider, which leads to a very comic booky line, "We'll meet again, Spider-Man!" Peter then has to save MJ because poor Harry was knocked out by some rubble and he swings her to safety. She asks who he is and he happily answers, "Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man." We then cut back to Norman Osborn, who realizes he was the assailant who killed the board of directors, and the evil side of him starts to convince him that they need to recruit Spider-Man to their cause or they won't win. Also, fun fact, Willem Dafoe actually had 2 sets of teeth while playing Norman Osborn. He would wear fake teeth for Norman Osborn to have more perfect straight teeth, and he would use his real teeth when playing the Goblin. They did this to help better show the difference between their personalities. We then cut back to Jameson, who has dubbed the assailant the Green Goblin. The Goblin turns up and starts threatening Jameson for the information on who takes the Spider-Man photos, and to Jameson's credit, he doesn't give Peter's identity away, saying all the stuff comes in the mail. I think this says a lot about Jameson's character, because for most of the movie we've seen him as just this money-hungry person, but then when someone's life is in danger, he actually rises to the occasion and does the morally correct thing, which, in my opinion, shows that despite this all, he is still a morally good character, but that's just my opinion. Peter appears as Spider-Man, but the Goblin quickly knocks him out and takes him hostage. The Goblin then tries to convince a temporarily paralyzed Spider-Man that he should join him because despite everything he's done, the public will eventually hate him, and that if they keep fighting, many innocent people will die. And then the next day, there seems to be some truth to what the Goblin says because now the public seems to be scared of him and there's a warrant out for Spider-Man's arrest. We then get another scene with Peter and MJ, with them talking about an audition that MJ has failed to get. But then she goes off to have a date with Harry, but then she is attacked by a group of predators, which forces Peter to rise to the occasion and save her again as Spider-Man. This leads to the iconic upside-down kiss in the rain, which, fun fact, was actually very hard for Tobey Maguire to film because he was upside down, there was water pouring on him, and it kept blocking his sinuses, so he literally couldn't breathe. And despite this moment being iconic, I think it's moments like this that have caused a lot of people to criticize this version of MJ, because even when she's in a relationship with someone, if someone's giving her enough attention, then she's falling for them, and then she starts kissing them despite already being in a relationship. So yeah, I can see why a lot of people didn't like this interpretation of MJ. This is followed by a burning building scene where Peter has to save a woman's baby from the burning building. The woman is very grateful, but the cops are coming up saying, oh, you're under arrest, but then they hear someone else in there, so Peter says, oh no, I'm going back in there, and the cops are like, yeah, do what you need to do. So he goes back in there, but lo and behold, who was the other person in the building? It was the Green Goblin. This leads to another fight as Peter has refused to join the Goblin. What's really cool about this scene is that the Goblin throws these bladed projectiles, which leads to this really cool slow motion scene of Peter dodging the projectiles. However, one of them does cut him, which will be important very soon, trust me. Peter flees and the scene cuts to Harry, MJ and May preparing for Thanksgiving dinner. Norman has just turned up, but they're still waiting on Peter. They hear a crash at the upstairs and they think, oh, Peter must be here. They go upstairs, he's not here, because Peter is hidden on the roof to avoid anyone seeing he's Spider-Man. Norman almost discovers him when blood drops from Peter's wound, and yeah, he starts to think, what's happening here? And yeah, he almost discovers Peter's Spider-Man. Peter then comes through the door and May realizes that he's bleeding, so she wants to check out his wound and help him. Norman sees the cut and it dawns on him that Peter is Spider-Man. This causes Norman to get up and leave while also insulting MJ in the process. Harry doesn't do much to defend MJ, leading to a fight between them and her leaving as well. We go back to Norman's home where the Goblin convinces him to attack Peter's heart. So who does he attack? He attacks the Aunt May. Peter goes to visit her in the hospital, and based on words she said, he realizes that the Goblin knows who he is. MJ later visits May in the hospital where she asks Peter about Spider-Man because she thinks she's falling in love with him. Again, I think this is why the character was criticized. Peter tells MJ what Spider-Man thinks of her, which seems to really hit her in the feels. I also love how easily Peter can call Spider-Man a different person because despite them being one and the same, they really are two identities. Harry comes in and breaks up the moment, leading to him breaking up with MJ because he believes she's in love with Peter. Also, fun fact, the decision to dye Harry's hair to match Willem Dafoe's was made after shooting began, and this scene was shot before many others, which is why James Franco's hair is his natural black instead of brown as it is in all the other scenes. Harry goes to tell Norman about how MJ and Peter are in love with each other, giving Norman another method to attack Peter at his heart. We cut back to the hospital where May tries to convince Peter to tell MJ how he feels because everyone else knows, but this leads Peter to realize that the Goblin, knowing that Peter is Spider-Man, might go after MJ next, and he's proven exactly right when he goes to call MJ, and it's the Goblin who picks up the phone. Mary Jane wakes up on a bridge and witnesses the Goblin take a cable car full of children hostage. Spider-Man arrives and the Goblin forces him to choose who to save, either MJ or the cable car full of children, which is truly horrific because that is not a choice anyone should have to make. Thankfully, Peter is able to save them both by having MJ hold onto him, holding onto the cable car with one hand, and then webbing the bridge above them and holding onto that. And it's scenes like this that make us truly appreciate how strong Spider-Man is. Thankfully, there is also a garbage barge approaching who will allow Peter to lower the kids onto them, getting them to safety, but they have to get there first. Unfortunately, the Goblin intervenes and he tries to force Spider-Man to drop the cable car full of kids. However, this leads to a truly beautiful moment where the people on the bridge start throwing things at the Goblin to distract him, giving Spider-Man enough time to lower the cable car full of kids onto the barge. And what I find truly beautiful about this scene is that I personally feel this represents the goodness of humanity, because in a moment of crisis, they all united for the common good. They helped Spider-Man save those kids, and it is just a very beautiful scene to watch. It honestly brings a tear to my eye. After everyone's safe, the Goblin then attacks Spider-Man and they crash into a abandoned building where just one of the most brutal fights I've ever seen begins. And I mean, this fight is brutal, and what really sets it apart from a lot of other superhero films for me, like all those other superhero films are these big action fights and they just seem very unrealistic. This one is just, there's a level of realism to it. It is so brutal that you can almost feel some of the punches the Goblin lands on Peter, because you just know they hurt a lot. Which leads me to yet another fun fact about this movie. This scene involves Peter spitting a lot when he gets punched in the face. It was originally supposed to be blood, but they had to change it to spit to avoid this movie getting hit with an R rating. Initially, it appears that the Goblin has won, but at the moment the Goblin threatens Peter that he's going to give MJ a slow and painful death, Peter gets enraged and absolutely starts dominating the Goblin, and this is sort of a thing I don't feel is explored enough in Spider-Man movies. They mention this in Spider-Man No Way Home. Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man talks about how after he lost Gwen, he stopped pulling his punches, and this is an example of what happens when Spider-Man stopped pulling his punches. He is just basically this unbeatable force. He is so strong, you don't realize how much Spider-Man truly is holding back against his adversaries. In fact, they explore this with Tom Holland's Spider-Man as well. He was also being beaten by the Goblin, but when he got angry, he dominated, and that is exactly what happens here. Peter was being beat, now he's dominating because he is angry and he's not pulling his punches anymore. I honestly think Peter was ready to kill the Goblin, but he stops Peter's rampage by revealing who he really is. Norman then tries to justify his actions, but he's also secretly programming his glider to sneak up behind and kill Peter. Norman also tries to play on Peter's emotions by saying, "Oh, I've been like a father to you, be a son to me," but Peter is just like, "I have a father, his name is Ben Parker." This pretty much takes all the hope of reasoning with him away, and he's like, "Godspeed." Spider-Man sends the glider at him, but Peter uses his spider sense, jumps out of the way, and the glider hits Norman, but not before this weirdly funny moment of him just being like, "Oh." Norman dies, but not before saying to Peter, "Don't tell Harry." Peter takes Norman home, but then Harry walks in, and he immediately assumes the worst, that Spider-Man killed his father, but Spider-Man flees before anything bad can happen. We then cut to Norman's funeral, where we see a mourning Harry say, "I will make Spider-Man pay for what he's done," which is really sad for Peter because, yeah, Peter now knows that his best friend secretly hates him, but at the same time his best friend says, "You're the only family I have, Peter," which, such a, I don't even know what to call it, I guess it's just a very complicated situation, because on the one hand, Harry loves Peter, he's the only family he's got left, but on the other hand, he hates him because he wants to kill his secret identity. We then have one more scene with Peter and MJ, where MJ finally confesses her love for Peter, but Peter turns her down because he realizes that no matter what he does, someone he loves is going to get hurt. So to keep her safe, he turns her down. They do share a kiss before all this happens, and MJ does realize there's something familiar about the kiss as Peter walks away. And while he's walking away, I think you can tell that Peter is finally embracing his identity as Spider-Man as he swings off. In summation, I really like this movie for being very character-driven and dramatic, but if I did have to give it any negative criticism, it would be the fact that it really doesn't show Peter's scientific side enough, something that is explored more in Andrew and Tom's versions, but here, it's really just about the drama of everyday life, but I can appreciate that as well, because something tells me it would be very hard to live and work and go to college in New York all at the same time, because I've heard it is extremely expensive to live there, but yeah, all in all, great movie, still love it. Only real criticism is that, yeah, I wish they'd showed Peter's scientific side more, but we get that a lot in the Amazing Spider-Man movies and the Tom Holland movies. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and if there's any movie you'd like me to cover, please leave it in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next Lukewarm Opinion. Bye!